Okay. While we wait for anyone else who might be coming in, oh, got someone, sorry. Right as I was saying that, I'm not really good at like doing different tasks right at the same time. So hello and welcome everyone to the last episode of season 2. I'm Lindsay Randall, host of the speaker series, sorry. Digging In is a series of live presentations with archaeologists from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And if you enjoy our programming, consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are able to bring you outstanding programming through support of viewers like you. And today we are very excited to welcome Kimberly Smith. Kim Smith is the Northeast Regional Manager for Gray and Pape Incorporated, located in Providence, Rhode Island. She has been active in archaeology for over 20 years with a passion for understanding and interpreting past human behavior. This talk was inspired by recent archaeological studies completed at the Salem Charter Street Cemetery in Salem, Massachusetts, and the fascination of the development and use of cemeteries in the 19th and early 20th centuries. At the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the chat function, either at the bottom or the side of your Zoom screen. And then we will give our speaker time to answer as many as she can, with the understanding that we might not get to all of them. So welcome, Kim, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, hello. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thanks for having me. I'm excited, but as I've repeatedly said, and anyone that knows me, eek! So yeah, as the Lindsay had mentioned, this talk was inspired by recent restoration and archaeological studies of the Salem Charter Street Cemetery. The studies identified a potentially unique pattern of cemetery detritus that I had not encountered before during the many cemetery restoration and relocation projects in which I've been involved with. And while Salem Charter Street Cemetery has its own land use history and some of some of the detritus may be associated with nearby earlier occupations and alterations to the property throughout history. Some of it may, in fact, be related to the practice of Victorian era picnicking and the celebration of life throughout cemeteries in the early 19th and 20th centuries. With that said, I will first provide a discussion on the development of the rural garden cemeteries of the era, followed by a general Victorian picnicking practices discussion, and then finally ending with the discussion on the practice of cemetery picnicking in particular and the types of material culture that has been left behind or we may expect to be found as remnants of this practice. So the Victorian era began in 1837. It's named for the new queen and continued through 1901. The Victorian age was a time of expansion, reform, idealism, invention, and entrepreneurial drive, but it was also an age of urbanization. For example, early in Victoria's reign, only 17% of the British population lived in urban centers. By 1891, this percentage increased to 31%. By 1901, a staggering 77% of the population lived in urban city centers. Urban parks and cemeteries were created in response to overcrowding and poor conditions, and in a measured response to the Victorian regulation and structure. Cemeteries were constructed due to the need for sanitary disposal of the dead, and thankfully, their approach did not echo the utilitarian design, but rather they utilized the bucolic design aesthetics with their roots in the late 18th century. Specifically, Bernardin de Saint Pierre championed transforming the commemorative gardens of the time into burial places of the great and good. He denounced churchyards and burials in churches as aesthetically and hygienically indefensible and disgusting. He proposed burial grounds to follow the examples of classical antiquity by developing public cemeteries created within the vicinities of cities, not located directly inside, They are to be planted with cypresses, pines, fruit trees, and monuments to induce, quote, tender melancholy to those who visited them. The living would thus, quote, derive benefit from the preambulations of such Arcadian places, whereas any unfortunate who stumbled upon the fetid and revolting churchyards could only experience horror, disgust, and an assault on the sentimental emotions. Overall, these landscapes echoed the elaborate private gardens of the elite, bringing the garden design to a wider public. They provided a reprieve from the congested living spaces of everyday life, and many were designed by the greatest designers and landscape architects of their time. And this is the period of the rise of the landscape architect. In Massachusetts, and actually within the United States as a whole, the first garden cemetery is that of the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. It was founded by the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. It was non-denominational. It was designed landscape that was open to the public. It's located outside of the city center at the time, and it included permanent family lots. Cities across the country began to use it as a model to create their own rural cemeteries. The Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn in 1838, and the Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, constructed in 1845, are only two of the many examples. An additional local example could be that of the Oak Grove Cemetery, located in Fall River, constructed in 1855. Tying this into Salem, specifically around 1855, Salem, the mayor noted that the old burial places were filled almost to capacity and requested new burial places. By 1871, the Salem Charter Street Cemetery specifically was widened to further accommodate more burials, and improvements were made, which included the development of pathways, plantings, and the installation of fencing and boundary walls. If there's one thing Victorians knew, it was that cemeteries were not just for the dead. They were also welcoming places for the living. When one is visiting a cemetery, they should not think only of death and loss, but they are to celebrate the life of their loved ones and consider the living beauty around them. Now, once reserved for the wealthy landowners to enjoy on their estates, the Victorians revolutionized the phenomenon of outdoor dining, bringing the picnic to the masses and paving the way for every family to enjoy taking their meals outside. Picnicking gained popularity as it allowed for the escape from the industrialized living spaces of the 19th century, and cemetery picnicking in particular allowed for the families to come together to revere the dead and focus on the future and health of the family. As a reminder of this time period, the child mortality rate was 47%, with nearly 470 children out of 1,000 dying before the age of 10. And the maternal mortality rate was the equivalent of 1 out of maybe every 100 to 200 people. So in other words, death was a constant visitor for many families. And in cemeteries, people could talk and break bread with the family and friends, both alive and deceased. Now, while picnicking also allowed people an escape of the Victorian parlor etiquette, it did call for its own proper behavior as found in the Victorian etiquette books and household management manuals of the day, such as here on the left, Mrs. Beaton's book of household management from 1861, Mrs. S.D. Powers' Anna Maria's Housekeeping from 1885, and Tinny Ellsworth Manual, Queen of the Household from 1901. In her now famous book of the household management, Mrs. Beaton outlines her bill of fare for a picnic of 40 persons, offering a detailed insight into the components of a Victorian picnic. According to Mrs. Beaton, quote, "It is scarcely necessary to say that plates, tumblers, wine glasses, knives, forks, and spoons must not be forgotten, as also teacups, saucers, 3 or 4 teapots, some lump sugar, and milk. If this last named article cannot be obtained in the neighborhood, take 3 corkscrews." Victorian picnic fare included a joint of cold roast beef, a joint of cold boiled beef, 2 ribs of lamb, 2 shoulders of lamb, 4 roast fowls, 2 roast ducks, 1 ham, 1 tongue, 2 veal and ham pies, 2 pigeon pies, 6 medium-sized lobsters, 1 piece of colored calf's head, 18 lettuces, 6 baskets of salad, 6 cucumbers, stewed fruit well sweetened and put into glass bottles that must be well corked, 3 or 4 dozen plain pastry biscuits to eat with the stewed fruit, 2 dozen fruit turnovers, 4 dozen cheesecakes, 2 cold cabinet puddings in molds specifically, 2 blancmanges also in molds, a few jam puffs, 1 large cold plum pudding, a few baskets of fresh fruit, 3 dozen plain biscuits, a piece of cheese, 6 pounds of butter, which if you ask me is quite a lot, 4 corner loaves of household bread, 3 dozen rolls, 6 loaves of tinned bread specifically. This is for tea, 2 plain plum cakes, 2 pound cakes, 2 sponge cakes, a tin of mixed biscuits, and half a pound of tea. Coffee, according to Mrs. Beaton, is not suitable for a picnic, being difficult to make. Things also not to be forgotten on a picnic: a stick of horseradish, a bottle of mint sauce, again, well corked, a bottle of salad dressing, a bottle of vinegar, mustard, pepper, salt, good oil, and pounded sugar. And if it can be managed, take a little ice. Beverages included 3 dozen quart bottles of ale, packed in hampers specifically, ginger beer, soda water, and lemonade, of each 2 dozen bottles, 6 bottles of sherry, 6 bottles of claret, champagne, and any other light wine may be preferred, and 2 bottles of brandy. Water can usually be obtained on site, so it's useless to take. Now in 1884, Mrs. Powers wrote her household management manual called the Anna Maria's Housekeeper, and this also included a chapter specifically on what to take for a picnic. She advocated for the use of camp chairs, mats, and swing chairs or hammocks. This is for comfort. 19th century art and photographs show us that picnickers did for some time also bring the dining room table. Occasionally an extra wagon was required just for the furniture for picnickers that they dragged along. And let's take a look at the photos here on the slideshow. On the top left-hand corner, we have the picnic table, some nice furniture. On the top right-hand side, we clearly have, they're more folding furniture, but virtually in the early 19th century, we're talking almost everything but the kitchen sink. Everything from indoors was brought outdoors for this picnic. Power noted in her 1885 book that the previous customs of good society from the earlier periods from Mrs. Beaton's time included the packing of fine wares, forks and spoons, but Mrs. Power specifically advocated for the use of unbreakable wooden dishes, as they can be acquired cheaply and you do not have to fret about their return. She says all food should be easy to handle, including rolls filled with salad, which is at this time, salad is cold cooked beef, ham, chicken finely chopped and mixed together with mayonnaise or salad dressing. And however, if you must follow the earlier good society rules, you could pack sandwiches comprised of sliced bread, specifically unbuttered, and these would be filled with slices of meat. But these, of course, would require that use of that pesky plate, knife, and fork, which she prefers not to have to carry. Power also recommended plain bread and butter for those who preferred it, chunks of cheese, and cold sliced ham, tongue, or chicken, all of which can fit neatly in a tin. For a colorful garnish or a side dish, she suggested pickles. Let's remind you that in this time, pickles are not only pickled cucumbers, as we are aware of today, but it also included pickled vegetables, chutney type preserves, or even preserved fruits. Now, Mrs. Power says, and I know, I shall not forget the cake, and you may depend on it being the only thing the other people will not forget either. And she strictly recommends a pound cake, fruit cake, or sponge cake. So cakes are very important for the picnic. To wash down this feast, Power proposed cold tea flavored with sugar and lemon, or lemonade made right at the picnic grove by mixing the syrup of lemon juice and sugar with ice water. The syrup and the water were to be packed and brought separately, with them placed in a jar, set in a wooden pail, to be strained through a linen cloth and to make the lemonade on site. Iced milk with cream may be taken in jugs, she says, but the preferred carrying method is that you pack those jugs and bottles into firkins or half barrels, as they are easier and more portable to carry. Once again, hot tea or coffee was determined as unnecessary, but if you must have some, she says, do not forget to carry your kerosene stove. Some people preferred wine, such as the chilled claret, but Power specifically states that she thinks healthy air, fresh air was stimulation enough for one's digestion. I will add that Mrs. Power's chapter is specifically about church picnics, so there's probably some bias. Now, Tinny Ellsworth Manual, Queen of Household, in 1901, advised the use of hammocks and camp chairs as well. She says meats should always be arranged for fingers rather than fork eating because, and I quote, nature did not make forks. This included fried chicken and breaded veal and lamb chops, closely and carefully trimmed, and sandwiches with, for her, buttered bread, filled once again with salad. Candied and dried fruits and a sponge and pound cakes were the recommended dessert, though fresh fruits are also agreeable. A common thread amongst all of these etiquette guides was that wine maybe wasn't as necessary, although Miss Beaton obviously liked her wine, but the rest say it's not necessary al fresco, as the exhilaration of the air should be stimulation enough for digestion. Miss Ellsworth follows up her smorgasbord of foods by stating that one must not forget the napkins, the forks, the spoons, cloth, tumblers, plates and cups and handles, no saucers this time, for the tea and the coffee, salt and pepper, sugar, a bottle of cream, and a can of condensed milk. So if we can take a minute to go back through some of these photos from the previous slides, we kind of can see a little bit of an evolution of the picnic of its time. We start in the earlier to mid 19th century. We're bringing virtually everything but the kitchen sink. The proper etiquette of quote unquote good society requires you bring your good wares, your dinner wares, your relish dishes, the multiple teapots. We're talking the fine china you're bringing outdoors. All you're doing is taking your etiquette from indoor outdoors. As time progressed, we're looking at making things more portable. We are starting to lay down blankets. We're actually sitting on the ground. However, for comfort purposes, per both Ellsworth and Powers, you may want to bring your hammocks and some foldable chairs, but we start to see the use of the actual picnic basket, and things are definitely more portable. We're also seeing the use of more tin, less ceramics, maybe some more picnic sandwiches are wrapped in paper if they're sandwiches. So things definitely evolved from the early 19th century towards the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As you can see, and as you've heard, the Victorian picnic was a very civilized affair. There was obviously dress codes involved as well. I did not go into that, but they definitely discuss the proper attire. Everything was codified. It was formal society. Not only were they having these affairs by bringing the indoor meals and the etiquette outdoors, it was also recommended that they have these picnics minimally once a week to escape the burdens of life. Remember, this is the Industrial Revolution where we're getting outside, we're getting fresh air. The picnic evolved over time, as we said. It develops from early the mid-19th century. Etiquette was very formal with the use of the furniture, fine wares, sauce dishes, tumblers, formal cuts of meats that are carried with them. But by the late 19th century to early 20th century, the picnic became portable, using the packable chairs, cloths, finger foods specifically. Cemetery picnicking remained a cultural staple into the early 20th century, which at that time is when public parks really began to sprout up across the nation, as well as the problem of cemeteries are starting to deny picnics and the use of their cemeteries. In fact, as this admittance ticket from the Woodland Cemetery, number 3 over here, circled in red, it says persons with refreshments will not be permitted to enter. This has clearly been an issue for some time. Even Miss Power in her manual describes that the debris, instead of disfiguring the grounds, should be collected in a box and taken away. And even today, 100 years later, we have an issue where many cemeteries actually have a policy in place that will not allow you to picnic within the cemeteries. Here's a news article from the Conservative in Denver from 1900. It says right here, a remarkable fad sprang up in Denver of going to the cemeteries for picnics. It became such a nuisance that thousands strew the grounds with sardine cans, beer bottles, and lunch boxes that police interference was contemplated. If you read further on, they didn't actually call the police, but this was a problem. Leaving behind garbage, detritus associated with the picnicking activities was in fact real. So we've gotten this far. What does it mean for the cultural materials or artifact patterning associated with Victorian picnic practices? For one, in cemeteries, the artifacts potentially associated with picnicking activities appear likely to be concentrated immediately adjacent to the gravestones, or they're found along the periphery of the cemeteries, perhaps as secondary deposits where the detritus has been pushed in lieu of a complete cleanup. Let's take a brief moment and we'll talk about some of these photographs here. For the most part, these photographs show the consumption of food directly adjacent to the gravestones. On the top left-hand corner, we have individuals consuming food leaning up against markers, which is not advisable, especially for preservation efforts. On the bottom left-hand side, we have, it's definitely 20th century, so we're looking post-Victorian, but I couldn't find of the time, but we have people picnicking on a tomb or on a grave. And even at that time, they're still bringing their plates. I see tumblers, I see some teaware. So they're still consuming food. They're still coming to the cemeteries. They're picnicking, and they're right there adjacent to what is likely a family member. And even on the bottom right-hand side, we have them maybe right outside the gate of a cemetery, or maybe that's right outside the family plot in particular, partaking in a picnic and picnicking activities. But again, these similar types of materials, so they're bringing their different boxes and woods. They have some condiment, glassware, jars, jugs, bottles over there. Still 20th century, but they're consuming right in the cemetery or adjacent to it. The top right hand picture I thought was kind of fascinating. It just shows a contemporary picture, mid 19th century, of just the sheer numbers of people visiting cemeteries at this time. So in addition to actual picnicking debris, you're likely to encounter other paraphernalia just from visitation, different coins, maybe a lost button, maybe a lost ring, etc. So from here, the archaeological remains of Victorian picnicking practices include, specifically, we're talking about fragments of tumblers, cups, saucers, plates, relish dishes, cans, including that horrid sardine can that was very problematic in the Denver news article, and a couple other articles I came across. We have jars that are from pickled goods or chutneys, but also condiment jars, bottles from refreshments as well as sauces. We have fruit pits, and we also have the faunal remains from different cuts of meats and the fried chicken or other lamb and veal that is brought into the cemeteries. So it's just a general discussion on some of the material remains and what they would have looked like. Tumblers and specifically, there's a couple photos here. If you guys are not aware of the Jefferson Patterson Museum in Maryland, they have, associated also with the Mac Lab, they have an amazing resource online with tons of artifact photos, diagnostic photographs of different artifacts throughout history. Amazing photographs here we're taking from there. The examples of the tumblers would have been colorless, leaded, press molded, paneled, engraved, or plain tumblers. I don't believe on the top right hand side there's one with some nice etchings. I highly doubt people are bringing their fine material goods into the cemeteries, unless it is early 19th century. Then they're supposed to, based on good society rules and etiquette, bring their fine wares. But otherwise, I think we're looking a little bit more at something a little more simple and accessible. On this slide, we're showing some of the plates, the cups, saucers, and even teapots that are identified. The top right-hand photograph comes from the Jefferson Patterson Museum as well, that shows some of the edged refined earthenwares that would be expected from the time period. And then the other photos are actually from the Salem Charter Street Cemetery. We have an array of small hand-painted, edged, transfer printed refined earthenwares. Notice these are highly fragmented. Yes, we recognize that there was some level of historical land use. They didn't expand the cemetery until 1877. Yes, there was some properties along the adjacent area of these Charter Street Cemetery, but it did pique my interest at the number of material goods, maybe the fragmentation, and the fact that we do have this Victorian practice that these may be remnants of it. The other thing to note again is that they're extremely small, they're fragmented. My guess, and this is all it really is that people would not have left large plates behind. Typically what might have been left behind is essentially garbage. They chipped or they broke and they cracked their china. Maybe small fragments of it remained in that they did not pick up, but the larger pieces maybe they would take back. If they were mendable, maybe they would have taken them and mended it. This is also dependent on other factors such as the socioeconomic status and the accessibility of goods in an area. What type of material remains would they leave behind? We also have some of these on here specifically, some of the white granite and undecorated refined earthenware, some plain wares that they would bring along with them. Condiment jars, pickling jars, crocks and bottles. You know, we talked about, every etiquette book talked about bring your salt and your pepper. We did in fact find a salt shaker head out there. There's a couple fragments of crocks and bottles. Maybe sardine crocks were used in the mid-19th century, as well as the pickling crocks for the various, actual pickles or pickled vegetables. On the bottom, we have an example of the different varying types of bottled glass. We talk about different ales, we talk about different wines brought in. And then other detritus that would be found might be all associated with what we see here, the different picnic baskets. We did not, in fact, find silverware, but it's possible that you would find different cutlery associated with picnicking, maybe fragments of tin. We obviously talked about the sardine tins, other tins, biscuit tins. Things might have been inadvertently left behind. So I guess in short, I wanted to have this conversation about the varying material culture that could be left behind from Victorian practices. To date, I have not seen this discussion in the archaeological record and literature, but clearly the cultural practice was there, and it was problematic to the point where people were publishing newspaper articles that stop leaving your trash in our cemeteries. There are numerous articles that literally are saying that, please clean up after yourselves when in our cemeteries. So this is something to think about for the archaeological record. And not only in cemeteries, this applies elsewhere. If you're working in a park or you're working in an area that is nice hill overlooking a beautiful scenery, how you start finding random fragments. Who knows, maybe you have an example of Victorian era picnicking. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Kim. That was really great. So if people have questions for Kim, you can send them in the chat to me. I actually have some questions already. So why do you think this is not a subject that archaeologists have really focused on?
I don't really have an answer to that. I wonder if people just a lot of these could be, the connection could be tenuous at best. They might have a better connection of like, oh, there's an extant structure that was next door. This is just refuse associated with that structure. Or really, I don't know, fill practices, but I think it's a legit possible artifact pattern that exists.
I also wonder if it's because typically when archaeologists are in cemeteries, it's to remove bodies. So like you're just focused on like the grave shaft and what's in there and being respectful and moving it, you know, to somewhere safer or whatever, right? Like you're not typically doing the other areas in a cemetery.
Yeah, totally. And how many archaeological excavations are also really going on in cemeteries? You know, there's a few, but not too many.
Yeah, typically we do not want to find human remains. So,
no.
And when we know where they are, we don't want to go near there. Another question is, makes me think of Lucy Maud Montgomery, the Anna Green Gables author, has lots of actual like short stories where like the whole town will go, you know, caretake cemeteries. So did you find in any of your research where in addition to the picnicking, would they also do, you know, like I think I went up, you know, Memorial Day weekend for my family and we clipped some of the bushes, you know, we kind of put flowers down and caretaked our family plots. Did you find that as part of the picnicking?
Yes, there's actually a significant amount of postings in newspapers for the church picnic that coincides with the cemetery cleanup.
Oh, okay.
So there's a significant amount of that has occurred.
Okay. In terms of the Salem charter, was it the plates that you found the highest number of artifacts for, or?
So Salem was interesting. Yes, we found a significant amount of plate debris. A lot of the debris that we found at Salem was largely pushed to the back end. We do know that they did land modifications out there. They leveled it multiple times in the 1890s. So I don't know if that's a product of the grading activities at that time, or if this is just how they decide to handle their trash. Yes, it was plates. We had some other random things. We did have, I forgot to mention, but we had Rockingham ware teapot fragments out there. So there's definitely that. There were some other awesome pre-dating.
Is that a cat?
Yes, I know.
Cats.
Sorry, I'm trying to
never be
away.
Sorry. We love babies.
The Galt Pickman house is there on the right-hand corner. There was actually refuse associated with that 17th century occupation there and some trash pits. So there is clearly some preservation in that cemetery. So I don't know for sure what level of grading and if that affected this patterning or not.
Okay. We have another question related to the Salem Charter Street. So what necessitated you and Gray and Pape going into the cemetery?
So Salem, and they just reopened, they were restoring their cemetery. They were fixing their walkways and with the intent to have people very focused walking on the pathways instead of walking throughout the cemetery, walking immediately adjacent to stones, anything to kind of help the navigation to preserve the cemetery in a better manner. Also in celebration of anniversaries, they wanted to add some lighting to make it a little bit safer and some plants to beautify it. So it was really in need of some restoration process. And as a result, before they can make any ground disturbing activities occur, we needed to make sure that we knew where the graves were, because per usual, there's always unmarked burials out there. In every single cemetery, you will encounter that. We also needed to know what the depth of the burials were, as some of the earlier burials often aren't buried as deep as you'd like to think. Some of the winter burials, you know, it's kind of dig a hole and put someone in. It's cold, the ground is frozen, I can only do so much. So yeah, we needed to make sure that they were not going to adversely affect the resources.
Okay, we had a couple more questions come in. So the trash problem hasn't changed much, but it is more biohazardous stuff like syringes. Yeah. The needles get picked up, but I hate to think of the things archaeologists are going to find in 100 years. Is there any evidence of that kind of behavior back then, or is this new behavior?
I personally have not encountered any evidence of that, nor in any of the historical newspapers. Now, I did kind of stop glancing at newspapers post probably about 1930. I really stopped paying attention. So I don't know if it's a modern phenomenon or if there isn't a historical coincidence of it as well.
Okay. Another question is, do you think, or could it be possible, some isolated finds found in parks could be related to Victorian picnicking?
Absolutely. I think a lot of us just write it off as, oh, someone dropped something here without fully thinking about why. Are you bringing your fine china into a park, and I do believe that we've missed identifying this pattern.
Excellent. Well, those are the questions we had for you, Kim. So thank you. And thank you to all our viewers for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in August when season 3 starts on Wednesday, August 11th with Caroline Gardner. And again, we rely on the support of viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. So again, thank you, Kim. This was wonderful. This was awesome.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.